I mix what I like, 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 what I like. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And I'm joined for this conversation, happily, by Professor Adolph Reed, who, among many other things, has been a longtime activist and radical critical thinker. He is currently a professor in the political science department at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a constant writer and analyst, and we invited him to have this conversation specifically about a more recent piece that Professor Reed wrote called "How Racial Disparity Does Not Help Make Sense of Patterns of Police Violence." Professor Reed, thanks again for joining us.
Hey, Jared, it's always my pleasure, brother.
Well, let's just start off with what you have here in the title. I'll ask you to offer up your initial summary of what you have here. But what is it that you're trying to do or get people to think about in this article, again titled "How Racial Disparity Does Not Help Make Sense of Patterns of Police Violence"?
Well, I mean, my main objective is to help help figure out ways to combat this heinous problem, right? And I don't deny. I mean, only a fool or someone with tendentious motives would deny the existence of stark racial disparity. I mean, all up and down the criminal justice system, except perhaps that it may be the case actually that blacks are not disproportionately incarcerated among the population of people who commit crimes, right? Now that opens up to other problems about what gets called a crime, right, and so forth and so on.
And how are people policed or surveilled to be caught
Right.
in the first place? Yeah.
Right. But I guess I've been frustrated. I mean, as you know, about disparities discourse for a while anyway, and not just about criminal justice stuff, but about a number of domains, and that's partly because. Well, I tell you what. Like, I gave a talk to a union group a couple of months ago, and in the workshop that I led, I began by mentioning like a number of disparities: wealth disparities, incarceration disparities, unemployment disparities, and then I asked the rank and file workers, the vast majority of whom were black or Latino, if anybody was surprised to find out about these disparities, and of course nobody was. So my question then was, okay, well, why do we think that people keep pointing to the disparity as though pointing to the disparity does something to address it? So, I mean, that led to a nice conversation about political strategy. And in the case of mass incarceration, in the case of police killing, right, the limitation of the tendency to shift the focus to whether or not the injustice should be called racism shifts the focus of the conversation both away from the injustice itself, and my argument is shifts the conversation away from the strategic concern with trying to figure out how to build the kind of political alliance that you need to build actually to change it. People are committed to the discourse of disparity much more than they seem to be committed to strategic discussion about how to attack the injustices and inequalities. Is that I don't think that people have bad motives. I mean, my father used to always say nobody ever has bad motives, right? I mean, Hitler had good motives as he saw them, right? So the motive, is not the problem, but that they are enmeshed in a politics that, being an old guy, right, who was around for Black Power and the war on poverty, I can recognize the outlines of. It's a politics of getting stuff done by going to complain to your funder or the politician that you have a clientage kind of relationship with. It's actually as old as Booker T. Washington and Du Bois in it. And in that sense, it's a politics, even when it's dressed up as being leftist, right? It's a politics that's actually safely embedded within the logic of post-war racial liberalism, and at this point is substantively embedded as what I've described as the left wing of neoliberalism, right? Because the premise of disparitarian ideology, as I've called it, is that what's unjust about inequality is not the inequality, but how it's apportioned among ascriptive groups, blacks, Latinos, women, gays, whatever. And that is the essence of the utopian ideal of social justice under neoliberalism. Now, I understand this argument has made heads explode. I mean, I haven't been on Facebook since, I wasn't on for very long. I was on for a few months. And I got off after I did an op-ed piece about what Tim Scott's appointment to the U.S. Senate didn't mean. And I got like 400 right-wing hate mails in my pen email account. So I just got off Facebook. It always felt like a back door to my life was open anyway. So I don't know, but friends have told me about stuff, and they've sent me some of the wild charges and stuff. But that's what the point of the piece is.
Well, so very quickly, I mean, you do target specifically by name some of the more prominent names coming out of Black Lives Matter, including the 3 founding women.
Right.
And then you add DeRay McKesson. One thing I would want to point out as a critic looking at all of this is someone I think probably right in between your generation and that of the millennials leading this charge.
Right.
Is the first thing is DeRay McKesson has never been a part of Black Lives Matter. And one failure, I think, of that movement, as it's called, has been in not clarifying his non-role in Black Lives Matter as it's understood, and his own willingness to break off for his own, I think, marketing strategy, branding strategies. But you point out, and this was one area where I know a lot of the social media criticism is coming, and one piece of it that I shared is that you pick out the specific call of Alicia Garza, one of the 3 co-founders of Black Lives Matter, to protect the recognition of those 3 women as the founders, as part of your criticism of the need of this generation to brand and market itself as a method of liberation. While I agree with the last part not being valuable, as I've always understood her and others' insistence in my own defense of that position, is that it was to protect the role of women in the development of movements, which has traditionally been a problem in reminding people, that women play a central role. So that's how I took it, more than a personal branding mechanism for the 3. But please do talk a little bit about what you were trying to say there, because I do know that that's a core element of where a lot of the critique is coming from.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. But I mean, look, I think the prior problem is the disposition to proclaim the existence of a movement via press conference, right? Because the idea, right, that Rosa Parks, right, started the Montgomery bus boycott, or who, I don't know, even that Ella Baker and John Lewis and him started SNCC. The issue has never been who fired the first shot, who took the first step, right? A movement is a collective enterprise, right? And to the extent that there's something real and organic and dynamic going on, questions like who deserves the credit don't even come up, right? Because you're trying to go somewhere, right? And it's a collective project that people are part of, and people will have voice and standing based on their actual practice, right? So if the thing is real, right, then you don't have to protect the hashtag. And frankly, this may be a generational thing too. I just don't see the point of a hashtag, right? Politics that could be reduced to a bumper sticker is not a politics that's possible to fight for anyway. There is, and I think I said this in the essay as well, that there's something resonant about this, though, around the Black Lives Matter slogan, and it's quite like Black Power, right? And I don't mean this as a diss, right? Having been around for both of them, right? The slogan captured something, right? I can remember being 19 years old in 1966 very well, but the slogan captured something condensed, powerful feelings and a political sensibility. Problem was it didn't have any content. And when people start saying that, then you see the movement kind of scurrying around to try to generate some content. And the problem with how people approach our political history at this point is not following through, down to the concrete struggles, because what we had then over the last 4 or 5 years, depending on how you want to count it, the 1960s and like into the early 70s, was substantive contestation among black people within black communities in black politics about what black power was going to mean programmatically. Mm-hmm. And basically the other side won, right? The mainstream politicians won because they had a coherent vision and they had access to resources. And nothing builds a constituency better than access to resources. And it's not that they were right? It's not that they sold anything out or anything like that. And I fear that one thing that's happened that's at least reflected in this whole approach to politics and political criticism and a political discourse is that we are so far removed from having actual experience of what concrete dynamic political movements are, how they're grounded, how they live and travel from community to community or institution to institution, that I think that we've lost the capacity to distinguish between a dynamic movement and a press conference.
So, but it's in that last point that you made that where I tend to err on the side of giving more room for them to make these mistakes, and where I think I and some others, I don't know, have that sort of visceral reaction to seeing such a direct critique, because there was no inherited, institutionalized process of preparing people, politically educating people to inherit and extend a movement that had been crushed and disrupted by the most powerful state in history. So, right. But the other part of it that I think is important, I still think what you're saying here is vital. In particular, the other piece I wanted you to speak on very quickly, if you would, the concern over race versus class as an approach to political struggle, and how one side seems to be clearly more welcomed even in public, popular, neoliberal discourse than the other.
Well, look, I really don't like the race versus class construct. And okay. I know that might strike a lot of people as odd, right? Because I know that I'm identified with a class over race perspective. But I don't think that that's the most helpful way to get at this,
okay.
Right? And I think, for instance, that a problem that we have in how people tend to think about black politics in particular and contemporary, like the notion like a black freedom movement or a unitary black liberation struggle actually are unhelpful, counterproductive, because what they do is they abstract away from the actual concrete political contradictions and struggles and a differentiation among black people that occur along a lot of lines, but one of the significant lines that they occur along is class lines. And one of the reasons that I don't like the race versus class construct is that it presumes that class is something that exists outside the so-called black community, right? And race is the thing that sort of binds us all together in the so-called black community. But black people don't live on an island like in the middle of the Atlantic, right? They are embedded in the American political economy now more so than ever, right? Like it might have made more sense to think like that in 1948, but it didn't even make sense then, really, right? Preston Smith's work on the charting, like the distinction between the tendencies to a racial democratic approach and a social democratic approach inside black politics is, I think, some of the most important stuff for serious black progressives to pay attention to. It makes a lot more sense to, and frankly, I feel more comfortable, right, if I saw more evidence of discussions of that sort going on. And not treating Preston like he's Paul or whoever's in the Bible. You know what they say about Catholics is true, right? We don't read the Bible, but well, I'm not like that. But like this is a perspective, right? Like a deeper and a richer perspective on the dynamics of politics that's evolved among Black Americans. And if you dismiss that and don't want to deal with it, it's first of all certainly not because we're up in the mountains having to fight for our lives, right? I mean, people have a lot of time to read and think and study, and frankly, I mean, to be honest, it just strikes me as a sign of a fundamental political unseriousness. Now, I'm not talking about the 20-year-olds that I teach, right? But the people that we're talking about, who are the public faces of this tendency, are like grown people, right? I mean, they're up in their mid-30s, right? So when does youth and a naivete stop being an excuse for not doing the work you're supposed to do if you're politically serious, right? I mean,
So unfortunately, I'm pressed for time, unfortunately. So I won't put that on you or anybody else. But in 30 seconds or roughly, what would that serious political work look like going forward? What would you like to see happening or more taking place?
Well, I mean, I'd like to see more sober accounting of what the dynamics are, right? The deep structures that drive and reproduce inequality in American political society, right? And there are ways that some of those dynamics are racialized, but they aren't only racialized, and they aren't only racialized in the ways that fit the that fit the familiar food groups, right? Broke white people are racialized pretty much the way blacks are, right? And I guess one, as well as Latinos and Asians. I mean, the points I make in that essay, but I guess one rule of thumb would be just conceptually, right? To stop thinking that racism is the one conversation stopping evil, right? I mean, I don't mean that in any way to diminish the significance of racial injustice and inequality, but I think once we start to think about race as one of several mechanisms that divide the population up into folk stories about who deserves and what kind of treatment, then that actually makes it a little easier for us to think concretely about what race does and what racism and does and how racial inequalities are reproduced. And I think it also puts us in a better position to think about ways to try to connect with a broader base, or to build a broader base that we need to have to do any of this stuff that we want to do, right? Because we can't do it by going to the Soros Foundation.
Amen to that.
Right, or Ford or whatever, and certainly not to the Booth School at the University of Chicago.
Well, Professor Reed, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it, and I encourage.
All right, know that.
Yeah, and I encourage people to check out the piece. We'll, of course, link to it at imixwhatilike.org, and it's again called "How Racial Disparity Does Not Help Make Sense of Patterns of Police Violence," which we're apparently going to continue to get plenty of and have. Reason to continue to having these conversations. So.
Yeah, alas. Yeah.
Thank you again. Take good care. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace to everybody and catch you in a whirlwind. I mix what I like, 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 what I like.